Welcome back to another episode of Office Talk. Now, I'm excited to bring you today's interview with Helena Bowen because if you've ever really thought about it, whether you are speaking on a world class stage at an industry conference or an event, or you're just doing an Instagram story or a Facebook Live, or you're in a group setting in person, we all need to communicate our thoughts in clear and effective ways that can hopefully inspire and move the person who's listening. I'm going to be talking to Helena Bowen, who's a speaker coach, a speechwriter, and a producer, and she's going to be sharing some of her best tips. These are the ones that she shares with her own clients who often grace the various TEDx conference stages about how to become a better speaker. Let's go to the conversation. Hey, Helena, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I wanted to have you on because speaking has been such a I just enjoy it so much personally.
Yeah.
And it's just been such a great way for me to connect with other folks in the industry or in just the marketplace, whether it's for clients or for connections. And I know that it's something that people kind of think about and they always will say, oh, I want to do more speaking, but it can be a
Mm,
very scary endeavor for some folks. So I really want to dive into kind of what makes really great speech or a great presentation. But before we do, why don't you bring our
sure.
listeners up to speed about who you are, what you do, and all that good stuff?
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. I am a speechwriter and speaker coach, and I fell into that very, very accidentally. I was working in Hollywood. I went to film school. I very much thought I was going to be in Hollywood forever. For a number of years, I was working on set as a camera assistant and then eventually an assistant director, wound up at HBO. But I come from a very academic household and world, like a very scientific upbringing. Both my parents are veterinarians, and then I went to Boston University for school. And what I found is that going from this super smarty pants academic world into the world of Hollywood, it was very much culture shock. Like, Hollywood is the exact opposite of all of that. It's very much about who knows who and your network and being seen and like entertainment. And so I found that I was really craving and missing that other part of myself. It actually came about when I was working on the show Sex Sent Me to the ER on TLC, which is one of TLC's hit shows. I was working on 35 episodes back to back of that show, which was like a massive series order. Normally, they don't order that many episodes, but they happen to. So it took almost an entire year of my life. And that show just beat me down. And I was really craving something else. So I started looking into how to get more involved with TED and TEDx because that's just something that I already kind of liked on the side. And um, basically, I went to a TEDx in Los Angeles. I won't say which one, but I went and I was expecting it to be magical and wonderful and everything I was looking for, and it was really not. So I decided, okay, this is something I can do myself. Like, I have all these production skills from working in Hollywood. So I decided to go to TED's training in Vancouver that they have every year at their main conference. They bring in a bunch of people from around the world who want to be TEDx organizers or already TEDx organizers, and basically teach them how to put on a really great event, what makes a great TED Talk or TEDx talk, and gives them all these tools and resources basically to put on events in their own style. So went to Vancouver, basically spent my entire bank account on that trip. And it ended up working out in ways that I never could have imagined. I met a bunch of amazing people. I instantly just clicked with everyone. It was like, these are my people. And in a way that I hadn't ever felt before. So it very quickly went from just being this kind of like passive interest that I had to being my whole life. So I still, in the meantime, I got a job at HBO and I worked at HBO for almost 3 years. But that whole time I was working at HBO, working with speakers and coaching people was my side hustle. So I was using up all of my nights and my weekends, mornings. I would get to HBO super early and then just do phone calls in the conference room with potential speakers. And luckily, HBO had a super generous vacation policy. So I was spending 20, 25 days a year on the road working with various TEDx people while I was still working at HBO. And eventually it came to the point where it was like, I should just do this full time. So I left my job at HBO, and ever since I've been working full time with speakers. And I would say about 75% of my clients are on the TED or TEDx stage, and then a handful of other people at conferences and galas, and then inside corporations too.
I love that story, and I love how you followed kind of your interest and your curiosity and things that would light you up, and you just kind of followed that, and almost like an intuitive following, and just it kind of unfolded in what seems like a pretty
Mm-hmm.
natural way. When you look at speaking and you're working with
Yeah,
somebody, when someone comes to you and is like, I want to be a TEDx speaker, I'm going to be speaking at this event and I really want to improve, what are some of the kind of the biggest, I don't want to say mistakes, but
sure.
some of the things, areas of improvement that you work on with these speakers? How do you advise them to become better at what they do?
Sure. So I think one of the biggest misconceptions around what I do is a lot of people think a speaker coach is just someone more kind of in the acting coach kind of realm where you're saying stand up straight and walk around the stage this way and do this with your hands. And that is a small, tiny piece of what I do. But actually, most of what I do is content development and strategy and speech writing. And so I would say that's one of the biggest misconceptions around speaking is the skills that I think make people the best speakers. Actually, it comes down to more writing. And so most of what I'm working with any speaker on is how to write their speech and really develop their ideas in a way that it lands. So I think first, just knowing that if you're already a good writer, you are so on the path to being a good speaker, first of all, because people, I think, have that misconception that they have to just come up with these ideas brilliantly off the top of their head. And it's so not the case. Speech writing is all about preparation in advance. And with a lot of the speakers that I'm working with them for 2, 3 months in advance of their event a lot of the time, especially when it's a big event like a TED or TEDx talk or a big gala, something like that. But I would say the number one thing that I'm working with people on is clarifying their ideas and having one really solid message. Because the biggest mistake that I see generally in public speaking is that people are covering way too much. Basically, they're cramming a diverse set of 20, 30 different ideas, super, super broad, into one speech. And as a result, the audience might have a good experience. They might kind of enjoy it and enjoy the flow of the conversation, but they're not really, really learning one concept in depth. And that is really going to have an impact on whether or not they remember your speech years into the future. So I think the biggest thing with all speakers when I start working with them is taking what they want to talk about it and then narrowing it even more. And oftentimes people find that really hard, as you can imagine. A lot of the TED and TEDx speakers that I work with, the thing that they're talking about is their whole career. Like
Yeah.
it's something that they've been working towards for 30 years. And so the idea of, oh my God, how do I cram all of that into 12 minutes seems impossible, but it's really not about cramming things. It's about taking a very intentional slice, picking one small thing, and then going into that in depth. And then if people love it, then people are going to come find you for more stuff, but you don't feel like you have to cram everything into one speech.
Yeah, I remember I had a teacher once who was like, you have to focus on editing. Editing is so much
Mm.
harder than the creating sometimes. How do you help kind of hone in on that one theme or with that one concept and edit out and take out all the fat essentially?
Sure. So typically with speakers, they'll come to me with kind of a general idea or a general outline of what they want to speak about. And then we think about, what is most important for them to share for themselves. Like, how will this speech benefit the speaker? So that might be professionally, it might be unifying your team around a message, it might be getting people to change their behavior or habits, whatever. How is that speech going to help you? And then on the flip side, who are you talking to and what do they need to hear? So I think that's a place where a lot of speakers go awry, is they don't really think about their unique special position in the world and how that can play out in a speech. I really want speakers to give the speech that only they can give. So a lot of what my job is to try to figure out pretty quickly what makes a speaker really unique and then just double down on that. And then on the flip side, a lot of people don't really think about their audience, or they say to me things like, everyone's my audience. They're like, this applies to everyone. And that's never true. So really knowing who your audience is, and oftentimes even just picking one person who's representative of your audience. If you know yourself and if you know your audience, you're that much closer to having a really specific speech.
I love when you said like you're trying to like double down on what is the speech that only that person can give. That can kind of put the person in a vulnerable situation, right? Sometimes,
Yeah,
like, because you have to really reveal yourself. Have you come across situations where you had to work through like with that with somebody where
for
they're,
sure.
yeah, like how do you, like, what advice do you give those people who are like, yeah, I'm afraid of showing that part of myself, even though you know as a
Sure.
speechwriter that that's what's going to actually move the audience.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the core thing to remember with speaking, and the reason why I think it's such a powerful medium, is that people connect with other people. And so I've seen the impacts that I've seen with some of the TED and TEDx talks that I've worked on are completely mind blowing. And I think the difference is a lot of these people have put out their work before in the form of journals, in the form of media articles, whatever. But when you put someone on a stage and you see the person and you hear their voice and you hear them telling their story or whatever, people just connect with it in a way that you do not connect with the written word. And so I think that is persuasive, thinking about what the potential impact can be from you sharing yourself and sharing your story. It can just have so much more of an impact. And this is something that I run into all the time because lots of people, especially in academic and corporate world, are so trained not to share about themselves and not to share their opinions and to always hedge things and obscure things. And I think a lot of what I do is training people out of that so that they can really show up for people and people will follow you when you do that.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about like when I've been asked to speak, I've been asked to speak about law, right? And so there's only
Hmm.
so much, like you're coming at it from a very academic kind of expert, like here's information that you need.
Hmm.
So if someone is, let's say, an expert in their field, how do you intertwine that where you have to deliver this content that is
Hmm.
actionable and is valuable, but then how do you balance that against well, I want to show a part of myself, I want to tell these stories, or I want to paint these pictures for you that are going to maybe move you to take action or make
Hmm.
this more memorable. Is there anything there that you can share?
For sure. I spend a lot of time working with people on their stories and storytelling because when you look at audience surveys and when you think about what an audience will remember, it's always the stories. Like when I read through, a lot of times at these bigger TEDx events, they'll have thousands of people and we'll get so much amazing data back from the audience and what they think about different speakers' talks and what they remember and all of that. And people are never quoting facts and figures and statistics in the audience feedback surveys. They are always saying, oh, I love this story. I love that story. We're just so wired as humans for storytelling. And I think if you can bury your message and your facts and your statistics and everything that you need to communicate into stories, people are going to remember them because people will remember the story, and that story will trigger them to remember the facts, the figures, the statistics. Whereas on the flip side, if you're just going into a barrage of information, that works in some contexts, but that's, you pretty much have to rely on your audience taking exceptional notes for them to remember it. Whereas that's where I work with speakers to kind of bury their information within stories so that it will really stick whether or not they're taking notes.
Yeah. I find that the stories sometimes are the difficult things to come up with, right? Because you're like,
Yeah.
yeah, I know the stats, I know the figures, the stories. It's hard sometimes to generate those. I came from a dance background where choreography and stage presence, I learned that and I learned the value of
Mm,
that. And I remember when actually I was in law school and I took a trial advocacy class, it felt so much like a performance to me, right? When you're kind of
yeah.
standing in front of the court or the judge and the jury, like it is a performance. I know you said you focus mostly on the content, and that's the
hmm
bulk of what really can sway an audience. But where does the kind of the body language or some of the other props or aids, such as slides or imagery, where does that come in?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's definitely important. I was very disappointed when I started doing this work because what I'd learned in Hollywood was really that if you start with a solid script, and as long as you have good people working on it, like that makes all the difference. If you start with a shitty script, you're going to have a shitty movie. Sorry. It's just that's what's going to happen. And so I really thought that that was going to be the same case for public speaking. And it turns out that's not true. And so I worked with all these people who had these amazing speeches, and the speeches themselves were just so beautifully written and perfect and inspiring. And then their delivery would completely sink that ship. And so I, over time, have shifted more and more and more to trying to lock someone's script as soon as possible, within reason, of course, and then switch over to focusing on their delivery. But I will say, I feel like there's this trend everywhere, moving away from the more perfect, polished, speakery speaker, kind of like that perfect image that you have of what a professional speaker should be like, to something that's way more casual and way more kind of off the cuff conversational. And in fact, that's what I tell all the TED and TEDx speakers that I work with, is that the perfect vibe for your talk it's just that you're having one casual conversation with a friend over a beer or over coffee. That's what we're going for. Because I think people, especially with the proliferation of things like TED and YouTube, you look at these YouTube stars and none of them are perfect speakery speakers. They're very from the heart. They're very conversational, very off the cuff. And I think that's where we're moving with public speaking, is that people can see right through that perfect speaker, and they would rather have someone who's more human and more themselves. So when I work with people on their delivery, it's oftentimes more kind of putting people at ease and getting them to practice their speech so much that it's not a matter of putting on a performance or being a different person. It's a matter of really kind of coming across as your most normal, natural, everyday conversational self.
Well, that takes the pressure off, right?
Yeah.
Well, and part of the reason why I wanted to have you on as a guest was because speaking isn't nowadays just reserved for the stage, right? We have stories and we have so many ways to broadcast our message. It's important to think about speaking, and kind of the storytelling and whatnot in those contexts as well. A lot of the people who are listening are probably not going to be on a stage, or they're not professional speakers in that sense, but they do speak, whether it's at a workshop or in a Facebook Live or whatnot. What are some other tips that you would give someone like that to improve their speaking, their messaging?
So I think number one, again, is coming up with one specific, very clear message and not being tempted to include everything. I think another one that's really interesting that comes up a lot, especially with people that I work with who are professionals, and I would say most of the people, interestingly, that I work with are not professional speakers. They're academics and researchers and writers and all of these different professions. But there's this kind of bizarre misconception around speaking that to sound smart, you need to use all these really big fancy words and you need to, use all of this business jargon. And it's actually the exact opposite of the truth. And I think the reason why TED has been so successful and some of their talks have been so viral is actually that they take these super smart people and then they explain things very simply. So when you look at someone like Ken Robinson or Susan Cain or some of the most popular TED speakers on TED.com, most of them are writing at a second to fifth grade level. So they're able to explain their concepts so simply, and in turn, that makes the audience feel smart. So I think the key for a lot of people is to take as much jargon as possible out of any of your speeches. You really want to speak at a much lower level than you think is necessary. And instead of that making you look dumb, it's actually going to make you look really smart, because when the audience can understand what you're saying, they themselves are going to feel smart. And then bonus, they're going to share it with all their friends, and that's going to keep sharing. That's how things go viral. So I think that would be the most common thing that I see, especially in a professional setting, is people just loading their script with jargon. And then my job is to take it all out, take all the jargon out, take all the cliches, and just communicate in the most plain, simple language possible.
I don't know if it was if it was something I saw or read that with, kind of the Trump Clinton campaign, that's
Yeah,
what Trump kind of that was one of his strengths, is that he, whether you agree with him or not, whether it was offensive or not, that he spoke kind of the common man's language, and he
yeah,
was able to connect to his base because he simplified things to an extent that,
100%.
yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I use that example all the time, for better or for worse. I mean, the concept of build the wall, super easy to understand. Anyone can understand that concept. And I think that's something that a lot of politicians can learn from, is being able to communicate in a way that everyone's in the boat. It's challenging because you really have to know your stuff in order
Yeah.
to be able to understand it simply. Like, you have to know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But it's really powerful when you can do that.
Yeah, and that's like, because I mean, I'm just like nodding my head here because that's essentially what I'm trying to do, right? Is take these like really dense concepts that there is no black and white. Usually it's a lot of gray, and break it down to these nuggets that people can at least understand the boundaries and kind of understand what the kind of the main anchors are in this area called law, and then they can
Yeah.
take it to that next level. So, if someone wants to work with you, what can they expect?
So I think the number one thing is just having an actual speech to work on. So people come to me all the time and want to kind of improve their speaking skills generally. And I find that it's just not that effective. It's one of those things where it's so much better if you have an actual project to work on. Honestly, even if you're just doing a project for the sake of improving your skills, it's so much better than not having something to work on. So number one is having an actual speech to work on, whether that's a TEDx style talk, a conference presentation, a keynote, an all hands, a town hall, whatever. Just being specific about what it is that we're trying to create. And then for me, usually I'm working with people on four different things, starting off with the strategy. So like I said earlier, who are you? What are your main skills and talents? And then who are you speaking to? And how can you kind of find that perfect Venn diagram center of those two things so that you'll have a really impactful talk? And then number two would be speech writing. So as I mentioned earlier, I spend oftentimes weeks or months helping people iterate draft after draft after draft, really polishing something and making something incredible. Those, of course, are the cases where it's a really important talk, like a TED or a TEDx talk. You might not spend so much time on something like an all hands or a town hall where it's just internal and just for your company. But I will say the benefit that's an interesting trend that I keep seeing happening is a lot of times with TED and TEDx speakers will spend months creating this perfect, amazing, persuasive speech. And you may think that time and effort is kind of just lost in the speech writing process. But a lot of people end up then using words and phrases and snippets and sentences that we create for the talk in all of their marketing. So I've seen speakers completely redo all of their websites and how they talk about, their subject in media interviews and everything based on what we've written together for the speech. And then next thing would be slides. So if someone does have visuals or work on those, that's one of the biggest mistakes, I guess you could say, that I see with people, is that they start with their slides and then try to put the content to the slides and not the slides to the content. And so I usually have everyone completely finish your script, or at least 95% of the way, before you even think about what your slides are. Because it's a huge waste of time if you start with your slides and then have to redo everything and do your slides again in the end. So slides third, and then fourth, we'll just work on delivery. So whether that's TED or TEDx style, where everything is essentially memorized, I can give you tools on how to memorize a talk like that. Or if you're working off a prompter or notes, I'll work with people depending on what their format is to make sure, like I said, that their delivery is coming across as very conversational and kind of their best version of themselves at a coffee shop or at a bar.
That's so interesting what you said about the slides, because I actually start with the slides because it helps me organize my thoughts and like outline what I'm saying. And so now I'm like, oh, maybe I shouldn't be doing that, or I should be doing,
Yeah.
the outline just on paper or whatnot, and then kind of just organizing the thoughts there. So that's an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
Do you even put a lot of content on the slides, or are they just more
No.
like visual kind of aids to reinforce a point?
Definitely
Yeah.
visual aids. I find that that's one of the biggest mistakes people make, is either putting way too much content on their slides or putting content that they're not saying on their slides, which just does not work at all unless
Yeah.
you're going to fully pause and let people read everything. But I think one of my favorite resources on slides is Nancy Duarte's book, Slideology. And her whole concept is making a slide like a billboard, like that you would
Yeah.
see when you're driving down the street. You just kind of glance for a few seconds and then keep driving. So that's what I'm aiming for when I work with people on slides, is having things that really support the talk, but it's not the talk. They're
Yeah.
an aid. So for you, I would suggest, rather than starting off in the slides, because I find that technology, it works, but I think it's a little bit cumbersome to try to put everything into slides and then make your talk based on it. I just suggest starting with Post-it notes or note cards and using that as a way to outline, then switching towards the script. Because what I find more often than not is people start with 1.5 million slides, and then after they've written their speech, they find that they need 12,
Yeah.
for example. So I think it oftentimes ends up being this massive waste of time for people that makes their preparation so much longer than if they'd just written the script and seen what they needed based on the script instead of the other way around.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm thinking about when I went to a conference once, and just one of the more kind of effective speeches was, yeah, he didn't have a lot on his slides. It was like a picture and like a quote,
Yeah,
and or like a word that would kind of almost be like the just the start of the chapter, of like,
sure.
okay, this is the next idea I'm trying to talk about, and that was it. And then you would just focus on him and what he was saying and the stories he was telling.
I think the key thing to remember is that our brains can't do two things at once that way. Like, we can't both be fully listening to a speaker and tracking with them and separately reading content. And the problem is, if you see words in your native language, you just can't not read them, right? Like, you kind of just read them inherently. And so what I find is that people will put all of this filler content on their slides, and it just pulls all of the attention away from you, the speaker, to content that's probably not as important as what you're saying. And then people have a hard time following you, or at worst are just missing most of your speech because they're so paying attention to your slides. So
But
I would say always have the attention on you and let the slides support you.
yeah. I guess for me, it's because I'm such a visual learner that
Yeah.
like I need the slide to reinforce what the person is saying because I also need to take like copious notes to like really
Yeah.
hear like really have that embedded in my head. When
Sure.
I went to a class, it was a baby CPR class, which is totally not relevant, but you know he had no slides, and I found that it was so
Mm,
hard for me to follow what he was saying. He was a little all over the place too, but
yeah.
I was like, well, if he had just had a slide to kind of reiterate what he was saying, it would have
Right.
helped me as an audience member take in that information. So,
Definitely. No, I think that makes a ton of sense. And I think that's the case where with every speaker, I'm trying to evaluate, does this person need slides? Yes or no? And more talks than you think don't need them at all. And then if they do need slides, like how many slides do they need? What actually goes on the slides? How much content? A lot of times, what it is relying more heavily on visual content than on written content. So I think that can be really helpful.
I don't want to let go of my slides.
Yeah. No, I
I'm
mean,
just
and I don't
kidding.
want to take them away from most speakers too. And in most cases, they are useful. The thing is, you don't want them to be detrimental. And I think more
Exactly.
speakers than not have speakers that are actually or have slides that are actually hindering them rather than helping them.
Yeah, it's got almost like a security blanket, I guess, right? So, because you
Totally.
can, yeah, you can be like, oh, let me just talk to the slides versus talking to you. So, anything else, any kind of last tips you want to add before we sign off?
Sure. I think the last tip that I have is just to reinforce for people that public speaking is a skill that everyone can learn and faster than you think. There is so much fear language around public speaking, and honestly, it makes me crazy because I think so many more people would be willing to do presentations and do talks and whatever if we stopped obsessing over the fear of public speaking and recognizing that just like everything else you do, it's something that you're going to suck at for a little bit. And then if you keep practicing, you're going to get better. So I think that's just something to remember if anyone's listening and you're having a hard time even thinking about taking that first step. Just know that it's something that you can learn. I've watched so many people go from being truly terrible speakers to getting really, really good. And I think that applies to everyone.
And I think it's so much fun. I think it can be. And
Yeah.
once you kind of get over that initial, like that anxiety or the nerves, I think it can be so much fun because it's such a great way for you to connect with other people and share
Yes.
your message in a kind of in a more efficient way, you know? If people want to get in touch with you or they want to work with you or learn more about you, where can they find you?
Yeah, it's just my name, helenabowen.com. And you can find me on Instagram at Helena Speaking.
Awesome. Well, thanks,
Yeah,
Helena, for being here. I really, really appreciate it. And I know the listeners are going to get
I
a
really
ton of
appreciate it.
value from this.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day.
There you go. Now, whether you're speaking on stage or off stage, I hope you got a lot out of this conversation. Now, if you are a speaker yourself, or you are a conference or event organizer who often works and books speakers for their events, I want to remind you that you can find the speaker agreement template over at yourlegalbff.com. Okay, you guys, that's it for another episode of Office Talk. I'll talk to you next time.